Without further ado, I just again want to thank you all for joining us today. Our session today is our Hoppy Hour with talking about homebrew market. We got Drew Beechum and Denny Conn on the line, as well as Brian Pierce and Steve Thompson from Yakima Chief and a few other faces. So I'm going to pass it on over to you guys and take it away.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks, Nicole. Much appreciated. For those of you who don't know, I'm Brian Pierce. I'm our Vice President of North American Sales here at Yakima Chief Hops. And I'm really excited about this session today because homebrewing is actually what really got me into this world. I'm an avid homebrewer still to this day. My passion is probably in fresh hop beer more than anything else. So this is the season for me. And yeah, that's who I am. I guess, Steve, do you want to kind of kick us off? We'll go around and just kind of introduce all of ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. My name is Stephen Thompson. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, cover the central region for Yakima Chief, visiting breweries, helping them with their hop needs. My background originally was microbiology, food safety. I worked for a period of about 5 years for Dogfish Head Brewing in Delaware as their kind of quality supervisor. Worked for a brewery in Tucson, Arizona for about 5 years, and then I've been with Yakima Chief for about 3. So thank you all for attending, and hopefully we can have a good discussion here. I'm also an avid homebrewer too, so that's kind of why Brian included me in this, so thank you.
Let me see, I guess I'm next to Steve, so I'll go next. I'm Denny Conn, along with Drew, who's like right down there below me. We do the Experimental Brewing podcast, and we've written books, Experimental Homebrewing, let me see, Homebrew All-Stars, Simple Homebrewing. We used to go around the world talking about homebrewing, but that's kind of curtailed at the moment. But we're really happy to be here, man. Normally I'm up in Yakima for this every year, and this is as close as I can get this year, and let me tell you, it's been a lot of fun doing these.
Yeah, and then that leaves me. So I'm Drew. I'm obviously a home brewer because that's the home brewery right there, along with my nice hop. And with Denny, yeah, I write and I do a lot of stupid stuff. And really, I spend way too much time talking and thinking about beer. So here we are.
Oh, we have a column in Brew Your Own magazine, too. I forgot about that.
Yeah, you need to write it.
I was going to say I should be writing that, but like I said, I forgot.
Well, awesome. Well, we have several guests with us here today too. So if you guys want to go around and introduce yourselves, we're definitely more than excited to have you here with us today.
Sure. My name is Philip Mcintyre. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, part of the Bayer Brewers. Represent it, guys. Been a home brewer about 8 years and currently on a travel assignment for work. So.
Awesome. And Mark?
Hey, I'm home brewer. I've been brewing beer since about 2012. I'm in the Cleveland, Ohio area. I'm a scientist, and that's about it.
What kind of scientist? What kind of scientist are you, Mark?
I did research stuff in the lab for a biotech company, and now I've switched over to quality and regulatory filings type stuff.
Oh.
So it's just in time to be able to do everything from home.
Yeah, right. And Michael, how about you?
Hi, my name is Michael Fenders. I'm in the greater Philadelphia area. I actually live in New Jersey. I've been homebrewing for about 6 years now. Started doing it when I was in Japan because they didn't have a real big craft beer scene at the time. And I've stuck with it since I've come back to the US. I enjoy it and I like learning.
Awesome. Well, I think in the spirit of learning, it's time to get to some questions, isn't it?
Sure, why not? Let me see here. Going down the list here, it looks like Michael turns up first. So Michael, why don't you ask your question and let's see if Brian and Steve have some good answers for you.
Yeah, so I guess a few months ago, Yakima Chief did a presentation on survivability of hop oils. And I thought that was kind of cool. I was wondering if you guys had any other experiments or anything like that, studies that you guys are doing that you're excited about.
Yeah, I could probably start off with that. I think that sort of train of thought, like you mentioned in that presentation, we've actually, one of our virtual harvest sessions definitely covers that topic as well. And but I guess what's really exciting for us is that sort of train of thought of what survives in beer and what can we be doing from a hop side of things to really make the most out of that. So I think a lot of times when breweries are looking at hops, we often focus on oil compounds and things like total oil and what each oil might contribute. And, you know, the 9 that you usually see that are presented on like a certificate of analysis or something like that for a lot are really only part of the story. And then some of those actually have more or less impact in beers. So we're spending a lot of time here researching, you know, survivables, what stays all the way through the process, what's really key for biotransformation, things like that, and looking at what hop varieties really play the best in that space, and what can we be doing from some of our innovative products like cryo or even blending to really maximize the most of that, right? And so ultimately saying, you know, instead of just saying put these couple hops together, it's like, well, can we put the right ones together to create something where the whole is probably a lot bigger than the sum of its parts. So I think that's what's exciting for me, and I think that's really where we're beginning a lot of our work into this next year. There's going to be some really exciting blends and things like that we're working towards. We've actually done some trials over the last year. We've gotten some really awesome feedback from some breweries around the world on just what some of those blends and things like that can contribute to their beers. So I think that's kind of that's where a big focus for us is right now. And Steve is actually part of the team that's doing a lot of that. So Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the comment on the blending, and our hop blends that we are coming up with are very much based on these survivables and trying to maximize them in a blend by, you know, combining different varieties that then the brewer can use as a tool. So I would focus on thinking about our blends that we're coming up with as tools that brewers can use. And, you know, we have what we call expression blends, where we're maybe trying to come up with an alternative to a variety maybe that we can't grow here in the US, something like a continental hop. So we're trying to look at compounds within various varieties that we have that we could put together to then have a blend that can fill that need and be the tool for the brewer. And also, I think we'll probably get into some of the hop breeding questions later on, but the growers and the people involved with the breeding process, looking at those compounds and where they are in the varieties that are going through the breeding program, and trying to, you know, move along the ones that maybe have more of these oil components at elevated levels, knowing that in the future, maybe these play a part in a blend that we're going to make. So maybe from the grower perspective, looking at growing them, knowing that they're going to be a piece of a greater picture, as opposed to kind of a standalone hop. So I think that's pretty exciting for the growers to kind of look at it in a new way, as far as, you know, what's the impact going to be for the brewer and then that brewer's beer. So I think that's pretty exciting. We've also focused on trying to identify a maximal or optimal harvest windows, and it could be varieties that are, you know, a little bit older, like Cascade, that maybe has been moved around in the different pick windows, because, you know, obviously we tend to focus on the Citra, the Mosaic, the Simcoe, and maybe we need to kind of reevaluate what the optimal pick window is for some of the quote, you know, more old school varieties. So we have a lot of work that we do with our brewery customers, and a lot of different kind of blind samples we send, and we ask for their feedback. And then we try to kind of identify, you know, what harvest windows maybe were optimal for the sensory on those varieties.
By the way, I just want to put
ahead.
out there, if you guys are going to put together a blend of hops that are all about survivability, it needs to be called the Eye of the Tiger blend.
Drew, I wish you wouldn't have said that in air, because, you know, we're in the trademark process on that.
Yeah, we are actually. Yeah.
So yeah, we'll have to scratch that one off the list now.
So in terms of survivables, though, are you guys finding any like general trends or takeaways or anything? Is there anything about this that's like, oh yeah, this is a good compound that survives and we want to try and optimize for it?
Yeah, Steve, do you want to talk to that at all, or?
I would say we see a lot of focus on linalool and geraniol, and then trying to find varieties that have elevated expression of those. And those tend to be, in my opinion, biotransformative indicators. So if a variety is high in those compounds and you're going to be using them as a active fermentation dry hop, you're just going to be a little bit further ahead in having that biotransformative effect in your beer. So it can be a strategy used to kind of pinpoint where in your process you're going to maybe use certain varieties. Certain varieties maybe they're a little bit lower in that percentage of survivable compounds maybe is more advantageous to be used as a post-fermentation dry hop. So I think it's exciting for brewers to look and not just pick two varieties that sound cool together, but they're actually knowing, like, I'm going to use this hop in this part of my process and this other hop in this part, and hopefully I'm maximizing the effect. And then within that, you know, obviously I've seen some varieties that are very high, such as Idaho 7. I've seen kind of brewers migrate towards that variety with increased interest because of the fact that it contains so many of these survivable compounds.
So are you looking at survivables only in terms of dry hopping during fermentation? Or
No, I think we're looking at survivables too in temperature survivability. So think of, you know, if you're introducing something on the hot side, you know, even if it's late addition or whirlpool, what's something that's going to actually stay in your beer the whole way through and can be there for fermentation and biotransformation and ultimately carry all the way through. You know, I think sometimes when we look at like total oils, you know, you see that huge portion usually made up with myrcene. Well, myrcene usually doesn't survive being in the hot side of things. So you might look at a lot that's, you know, got like 2% right, 2 for oil, and then maybe 50% of that's myrcene. Well, you can't really count on any of that actually making it to your end product. And so sometimes if you're looking at just some of those kind of oil characteristics, you might actually not really, it might not be a good indicator of what your beer is actually going to be like. So that's what we're trying to focus on, kind of like what Steve's saying, is draniol, linalool. And we've actually been spending a lot of research kind of beyond what is normally on a C of A as well, is thiols and sulfur compounds, right? Things that the human nose and human palate are really keyed in on, things that we often detect in parts per billion, not parts per million, and what hops really express in those areas as well, and where can we be putting hops together, or just even finding hops that really express strong and making sure that they're being utilized. I mean, there's plenty of what I would consider older varieties, right, that exist that actually express really well in these areas. And I think what's something that's kind of, I think, planted the seed in our head is cryo, right? Is maybe taking a variety that's expresses really strong, but maybe has lower oil, lower alpha, is often maybe driven by some of its, or its flavors and aromas driven by some of what you consider the bract portion of that hop. And being able to take that and concentrate it and remove some of that, and now what you're left with is this really strong expression, right, of something that it's actually really good at. And so I think we're finding some really interesting ways to maybe use varieties that are not top of mind anymore in the industry at the moment.
Cool.
Well, so Mike, is that enough of an answer for what you were looking for?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it definitely is. I was just wondering also, like, are there any like focuses? And I mean, it sounds like you guys are definitely looking at it for like on the cryo side and the blends. I was just wondering if there are any other things. You know, survivables is definitely like a, it makes sense why you guys focus on that. I was just wondering if there's anything else that you guys were looking at. And I guess you kind of hit up some of the other compounds and everything as well.
I think we're also focusing on some of the practices that occur on the farm, such as kiln temperatures. We're doing some trials this year on different kiln temperatures if it relates to hop creep. Our growers have become very, very good at the kilning process, so that I feel like the hops aren't heat abused like maybe they were years ago. Very, very efficient, very quick, and maybe that leads to some downstream, you know, things that maybe weren't issues in the past that are now. So I don't think anyone would ever want to go back to the way we used to do it, but we're trying to evaluate, you know, what factors maybe play into hop creep and how to mitigate it, and what tools we have that can help with that. So, and I mentioned the harvest optimization of pick windows. So we're always looking to get better at what we do and ultimately deliver hops that work best for the brewers.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think on like a non-beer focused, you know, answer to that question would be, yes, there's a lot of research when it comes to pick windows, farm best practices, right? Where really most of the quality resides and begins with in the first place, right? Is you know, optimizing the quality on the farm. And it's something that may seem like, well, hops have been grown for a long time, right? And especially some of these varieties today, even being around for a while now. I mean, Citra and Mosaic aren't necessarily young varieties anymore, right? Simcoe, even older. And so there's a lot of years of experience, and the pick windows have been pretty dialed in. But at the same time, as the beer industry has grown in general, there's also the challenge of just that pick window timing actually being harder and harder to fit the amount of hops in today. You think in the Pacific Northwest, there's less than 100 growers in the Pacific Northwest, and the Pacific Northwest supplies over a third of all the hops in the world. And so as that has continued to grow and expand, farms have real capacity constraints, right? On just labor, on how much they can put through a kiln in the day, how much they can pick in a day. And so when you see growing interest in some of these varieties like Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe especially, Simcoe is an earlier harvest variety, but Citra and Mosaic, unfortunately for growers, actually overlap in pick window, right? And so you have these two massive high interest, high demand hops needing to all be picked within a couple of days of each other across the entire Pacific Northwest. And so it's a real challenge. So there's a lot of opportunity there to look at what sort of innovations can be made at a farm level and with YCH and growers together in maximizing that and maintaining quality as things continue to expand.
Absolutely. It sounds like one of the things I'm hearing also is that we're going to have an expansion of language and what you guys can put on the hop packages themselves to be able to actually give people more of this sense. So I think that we do have a couple more questions to get through, so we need to keep moving. So I think, Philip, I think your question was next in the list. What did you want to ask, man?
All right. Every year I try to make a red IPA. I usually use Nugget, Centennial, and Simcoe. I'm trying to make a more dank, resinous, and piney and earthy red IPA this year. What sort of hop combos would y'all suggest for that?
Go ahead, Brian.
Well, nice. I'm gonna start out with maybe you're gonna pick up on this early from what I said, but it's September, so throw some fresh hops in there. Okay, but if we wanted to be serious about trying to follow a red IPA and maybe some like BJCP standards, when I think of red IPA, I think of very classic like West Coast, but we're gonna want more toffee and malt. And then if you're wanting like dank and more resinous notes, you mentioned Simcoe, Centennial, and Nugget. Yeah. I think Simcoe is definitely a great go-to for that style. I think if you wanted to pull things in the dank space a little more, there are, Mosaic can tend to have a little bit of that edge on it. That's for me personally a very favorite hop for a lot of what I would consider more of the classic IPA. I mean, obviously it's great in a lot of New England style IPAs these days as well, but I think if you'd find that Mosaic could definitely get you there, especially if you wanted to pull it in a little more of that dank character. And actually maybe some Columbus as well. I think Columbus could be a nice direction for something like that as well.
I was just going to mention that. That's kind of your classic dank hop, isn't it?
Yeah, it tends to have that, right? I mean, not always, but I mean, part of that is, this is maybe a little deviation here, but part of that is usually Columbus being a later harvested hop. It doesn't always have to have that character, but it's normally grown for alpha, right? So it tends to hang longer and build up alpha. So you tend to see that more, but we often get some early harvest Columbus and that won't have that. But I think for the most part, I mean, that's definitely a hop I would look for that kind of character if I was just to go to a homebrew supply shop or, go shopping online or something and find some hops for that.
Let's get a quick show of hands amongst the four of us here. How many of us were prepared to all say CTZ? Because I mean, that was my immediate. I was like, because to me, it's like Columbus is dank. So that was immediately when I saw that question, I was like, Columbus. But
what about you, Steve?
It's interesting to hear Brian mention Simcoe too, because I hadn't really ever thought of Simcoe in those terms, but now that I kind of reflect on it, yeah, absolutely.
I think of Simcoe as having a definite pine characteristic to it. Mm-hmm. And I guess one of my favorite hops every year is Autumn. And I think I describe it sometimes as earthy, but it's got that bright kind of lemon to it. And I advise a lot of my brewery customers that aren't looking to make a hazy IPA. They want to kind of make more of even a British IPA or like a standard IPA. They don't want the juicy notes. That's kind of a hop that is sort of underrated that plays in. It's lower alpha, but I get an earthy note out of that. It could play well in a beer like that, I think.
Well, and that plays. I mean, that still plays into that classical sense because I mean that. Didn't that originally come up as like a Cascade substitute or a Cascade neighbor?
Yeah, Tandem's actually Yakima Chief Ranch's #1. So it was the first hop out of that breeding program. And yeah, that was at a time of Cascade and Centennial being the U.S. landscape.
Yep. So that would make some perfect sense. So we got some CTZ, we got some autonomous. Denny, any other choices on your side?
Nothing I can think of right offhand because I'm so tied into that Columbus thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly depending upon the malt build that you're going to choose as well. Because I've seen red IPAs going two ways, right? I've seen like people who are doing a red IPA that's a little bit more of a throwback to the days like when we had things like Red Seal and those as actual popular craft beer styles. And to me, that wants a little bit more bite, I think. So I would even throw some Chinook in there just to get that right. But then you see the other side, the more modern red IPAs, where it's West Coast IPA, but then using something like say Red X or what's the Great Western version of that? Not Cara Red. Anyway, there's a Great Western version of that same sort of idea where it's just a red colored malt without the sweetness of a caramel. And if you're going for that and going drier, then I would not do the Chinook at all. And I would focus more on trying to use that Columbus and the Autonom and the Simcoe late, just to really drive the aroma.
Yeah, I usually do a Sierra Nevada-esque, their old Flipside Red, that sort of style red. So
yeah, so a little more classically caramelly and
exactly.
Okay, yeah, and so to my mind, I think for that, if you're really wanting to push that as well, I would also have a shot of Chinook in there.
Awesome, thanks.
All right,
Yeah.
any other suggestions, guys?
No, actually, Chinook would have been something I was thinking of before you said it too. I think that's it can bring some nice, like not in a bad way, but some nice earthy tones to some degree still, and some pepper. So I think that's like I think a spice a little bit sometimes when I think of Chinook. And I think that's a nice something that like none of the other ones we've suggested are really going to bring to any large degree.
Well, I think to me, it's like, remember back like, God, what was that? Like 15 years ago when Amarillo and those hops first started appearing, even Simcoe first started appearing, people were talking, oh, these are local human hops. They'll be smoother and all that sort of stuff. I found even then, like, at least for where my taste was, if I wanted an old school IPA, I needed something with a little bit of rasp to it. And to me, there is nothing better for giving you that raspy hop punch than a little bit of Chinook. So even though I'm mostly bitter with say like Warrior, when I'm doing my IPAs, I'll always have a small dose of Chinook in there if I want that little bit of just to give it the crunch.
Yeah, I'll have a lot of Chinook in there.
Well, that's because you're old and bitter and you haven't got but 3 taste buds left.
I was just going to say, because I'm a bitter old man.
This isn't a shameless sales plug, but I would also take everything we just said and use cryo.
Yes.
Yes. Not shameless at all.
No, it really doesn't. I'll just tell you, if you were to look through my homebrew recipe book right now, I think cryo is in every single one of them at this point.
Yeah, I agree, man. I use cryo as often as I possibly can. So. Okay, right. Mark, I guess you're up next, man. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Hey, thanks. So I've heard a lot about how the branded hops like Citra, they go through like extensive quality evaluations to make sure that they're all true to type and they match up to expected norms for the variety. So what happens to the lots that don't pass? There's going to be some that don't. And even though they don't match up to like the specifications of the lot, they could still be good hops that like, they're just not matching up to exactly what you would expect.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's actually something that we could probably spend more than an hour talking about, right? There's a lot of facets to that. And that's something that's definitely near and dear to my heart as well, because that's something that for me, I guess we didn't talk about this, but I'm very involved in a lot of our hop selection process here at Yakima Chief Hops. And so that's something that we talk about a lot is what happens with hops when they don't necessarily meet your standard criteria, and how do we deal with that? I think the first place I would start with that is we have, for Yakima Chief Hops, we have our Green Chief program, and then we work in partnership with Yakima Chief Ranches, who has their Footprints program. And in the beginning, that actually, both those programs are farm-facing programs that actually help set best practices and standards. So specifically looking at the Footprints one with Yakima Chief Ranches, all of those varieties, like you mentioned, Citra, they actually have spelled out pick windows for those varieties for the growers. They have spelled out different moisture, temperature limits, things like that. So anyone growing those varieties for Yakima Chief ranches, they actually have to meet these standards. And part of that footprints program is an army of interns that show up here every year in the Pacific Northwest, and they actually walk every field. They work with all the growers, and they're making sure that those things are happening. And also part of that consistency in walking the fields is looking for pest pressures, looking for, whether it be environmental pressures or bugs or anything, insects, stuff like that. But they're also looking for male plants too, and making sure that, that they're roguing those out. So they'll mark those actually with GPS. They actually have their own app where they mark all the fields and all the males. And then after harvest, they come through and they dig them all out. And part of that is for quality, because you don't want a lot of seeds in the plant. But actually the worst part about seeds isn't necessarily getting in the cones, it's them dropping, growing, and actually create, that seed is now a different variety, right? Because it's mixed with another plant. And so part of it is also varietal purity, right? To make sure that that whole field of Citra is exactly Citra. There isn't mixes of other things in there. So that's kind of where it begins. And if things aren't met correctly there, like if we're having a lot of seed problems or kiln temperatures are way too high, there's actually penalties in place, and then I actually work directly with growers before it ever leaves the farm on mitigations for that, right? And so sometimes that can actually be, we can't receive this. This isn't acceptable at this point, right? Because at the end of the day, when brewers are going to get their hands on it, whether it's a brewery somewhere in the world or even a home brewer, we want to make sure that if it says Citra on the label, that's what you're getting, right? It can't be something else. It can't be a mix of things. It has to be that. So that's the first step. With that in mind, though, we do have all those averages, and you might see those like in our hop handbook, right? Or you can find them on our website, things like that, where we'll say, here's the alpha ranges, here's the oil ranges, here's the HSI, stuff like that. That is actually where varieties come in, and all that information we put out there is actually based on averages over the years of lots we've received. And so where we see wild deviations, we actually look at a lot of that internally. And that's where when things fall within an acceptable range, we say, okay, this one field from this grower could actually be run pelletized or run into cryo or something, right? And one of our products and be sold as this. If something is way off spec and it's not necessarily anything wrong with it, but maybe the alpha is really, really high, right? Or it's really low or something like that. That's where we'll actually look at putting multiple lots together and blending something to recreate what it should be, right? So we'll take Citra that has really high alpha and a Citra that's really low, or maybe the oils, and we know blending them together, we can make that average, right? And so that's where a lot of hop blending happens, right? Is to make sure that there's that consistency, because at the end of the day, it is an agricultural product, right? And so there's going to always be variance every year based on just the weather of the year, some different pressures that we might get here in the valley or in the Pacific Northwest as a whole. This year we had some wind and we had some fires and smoke and rain and all those kinds of things. And so we're always looking to sort of say, how do we take that and sort of reshuffle things a little bit to make sure it makes sense? And so what you'll see actually, if you were to buy Citra, most of the time is sometimes it will be a single lot because it met all those specs and it went through our sensory program here internally and said, yes, this smells like Citra, it should be this, right? It meets all the right oil specs, alpha specs, everything. It was handled properly at the farm with the right kiln temperatures. It can be on its own. And sometimes lots need to be blended together to recreate and make sure that there's that consistency so that no matter what lot you're getting, it's going to be what you expect it to be like.
So as a follow-up question to that, then, I mean, if you have stuff that may be even more out of spec than you can necessarily save by blending, and you said obviously you reject some of those lots, but are you also taking like some of that product and using that? Maybe it's not the world's most perfect Citra, but it could fit into something like, say, a Veterans blend or another blended hop product. Or do you even try and start with those hop products to be from things that match the exemplar?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, if it's not acceptable as it is as a brand, even after blending, then it's not something we're bringing in, right? So everything for us is, it has to be, it's all like good, and then what do we go from here when it comes to blending? If something were not to meet spec, or especially if there was concerns around varietal purity, that's something where we wouldn't even want it here. So even things like Veterans blend. So like you mentioned that, what's actually interesting about that is when we're rubbing and smelling and selecting with everyone that participates, is we're actually looking at lots then that we receive and trying to actually match the oil profiles and the aroma characteristics that were described by the group. So they might be, we actually keep track, like let's say it's Simcoe, and everyone rubs and smells different Simcoe lots, and then they decide, okay, we should put 30% of this Simcoe in here. But that's from last year's harvest because we're doing this before the harvest season. we're going to look at that Simcoe analytics and try to match it to the most similar profile we're going to get in for this new harvest year, so that we're trying to recreate as close as possible that blend. So for us, really, blends are never an outlet for stuff that isn't already good to begin with.
I would definitely echo that. When we make these blends and we want to reference them as tools for brewers, we're not putting in varieties that we just have extra of. We're actually strategically trying to design the blend from the start to meet certain characteristics, and we're not really looking at offloading less than stellar stuff into blends. So I feel like that's why when you see these blends come out from us, that they're going to be very good tools. They're going to be very good quality, because we're not. That's our approach from the start.
All right, cool. Well, and then actually you did touch on one thing, Brian, earlier when you were talking about the smoke, because I know we had a bunch of people asking questions, going year to year, the varieties that we see. And obviously this year, the whole of the West Coast has been on fire. Are we going to experience a bunch of Roush IPAs?
Well, I sure hope not. No, that's a good question, and it's definitely top of mind, I think, for everyone. For us, historically, we've always had fires on the West Coast. It's part of the environment here, and obviously with human influence, right, we've seen that increase over time. But if I go back several years ago, we've never seen an impact on hops with smoke, especially environmental smoke. However, this year, what's kind of interesting is the timing and the density of smoke here was actually quite significant and beyond what we would consider normal. In recent memory. And so we have found some lots have expressed some smoke. And I guess what's important to note on that is kind of how robust our sensory program is every lot that comes through our doors is smelled by a full panel of validated sensory team members here. And if anything is considered unacceptable, even just in Aroma, they actually flag that. And it's something we set aside for further reference to see, is there any way to do anything with this? So it's been detected. I'll be totally, open on that. We've seen it, but I don't see any negative impacts when it comes to beer or hops this year, because it's in the aggregate of everything that we've brought in, it's less than 1% of lots.
So no matter what, even if you did get that smoke character on those lots would probably be flagged for potential removal, just to try and keep meeting the breed standard.
Absolutely, yeah, because we don't want smoke to be part of citrus character or mosaic's character, right? And so what's interesting. Yeah, what's interesting is for us is actually because this is pretty unique to us. We've never seen this. We're taking this as an opportunity as well to actually do a lot of research about it. So we're doing a lot of interesting trials here now on testing it in beer. We have our own pilot brewery here that we're doing stuff with on a regular basis. We're doing it in our lab and trying it in different product formats to kind of see, are there ways to mitigate this and plan for the future potentially, right? If this were to ever happen again. But yes, any lots that we deem as just there's no real solution for them, they would never make their way into the industry.
There you go, Mike. There's another unexpected piece of research that's happening. So, Mark, before we move on, any additional questions or comments around this?
So anything that's just way outside of norms that you can't blend in just gets discarded or sent back, or what? Because I can imagine that, like, let's say there was a lot of Simcoe that was, mango and peach, massive. Like, people would love it, but it's not Simcoe. So would you just throw it away because it's not what people expect, or would you call it something else?
I think if it was expressing maybe characters like that you wouldn't normally expect, there's opportunity to blend with other hops. And I mean, every lot of Simcoe is going to have a lot of little different things in them. But the very short answer, and actually you said it in a way I normally say it too, is if it's so far out that it's not actually Simcoe anymore, that's where, there's definitely times where we'll completely reject lots just because but what I would say is that's normally for something that's very significantly wrong with the lot, more so than just a aroma difference, because there is actually quite a bit of variance. When you look, an ideal pick window for hop can sometimes be within 24 to 48 hours. And you look at the whole of a Simcoe pick window, and it's usually, within a week, right? And so every farm is hitting different windows. So you do get different expressions, right? That's why you see some Simcoe lots are a lot more piney than others, right? And some are maybe like more heavy on fruit character and things like that. So it's not overly concerning to us if you get one that's like tons and tons of mango. But what I would say, actually, if we get something like that and it's abnormal, we usually also flag that and say, let's do a little more digging to make sure this is actually Simcoe, right? Maybe there was a mistake on the farm. That doesn't happen very often, but we've definitely seen that. And I think that's a big testament to our sensory program, where I've seen that, you know, over the years here, just someone will smell something and be like, wow, this is amazing. This is amazing Simcoe. What is this? And then we're looking and we're like, wow, that doesn't smell like Simcoe. And then we'll start digging and find out that maybe at the farm or even here at receiving, someone wrote the label wrong when they took a core sample of it, right? And because they were also doing a citric truck at the same time or something like that. And so that would actually be the first thing we would be checking if something was that off on pleasant aroma character, right? But you know, if hops had maybe other character flaws like really high moistures where they would degrade really poorly in storage, maybe they have really off aromas like just tons and tons of like moldy, you know, cheesy notes, things like that. Those are things that you don't necessarily just blend away, right? Because it's like, well, that's always going to be in there to some degree. So if it's beyond recovery in any way, there is a certain amount of hops every year that may not actually make it into our facilities.
And just real quick, so people can get a sense of scale, when you're talking about getting a lot in, how many pounds of hops is that?
Yeah, well, a lot can vary a lot. It's yeah, that wasn't intentional. But
it was.
But it varies a lot by farm. So most lots, you know, if you were to say a general rule of thumb, are anywhere between 30,000 to 60,000 pounds. But there's lots that come in that are much smaller than that. Sometimes, you know, you could have 4 or 5 lots that actually represent one field, but they were brought in separate chunks. And so generally speaking, that 60,000 pounds becomes an upper limit because you start maxing out how much a semi truck is going to hold, right? And what we try to do is not have lots come in like sub lots, right? Where we'll have a bunch of lots come in on multiple trucks because that creates some problems just from managing that level of inventory. So lots are generally cut off by about how much can come in and be dropped off at once. So, but we do get small lots sometimes. You know, maybe there's an experimental field or someone's growing just a couple acres of something. They process it and you get like a flatbed truck comes in with, you know, maybe 8,000 pounds on it, right? So lots can vary quite a bit.
There you go. Well, I just wanted to make sure that we got a sense of scale in there for everybody. Yeah. Although, I think it's time for us to move on to our next question, rip through these as fast as we can. So the next question comes from Eric, who is not online with us. And he said, in the hop breeding process, how do you determine whether a new strain has potential as an aroma hop? Do you target a high oil content, high amounts of specific oils, a unique aroma, or something else? And also, are you primarily using lab analysis or sensory analysis to make this determination?
I think before I even answer that, one quick thing I feel a little remiss that I didn't say in the beginning is we invited everyone to come on that answered questions. And I know not everyone's here, but I didn't maybe set this up. And I know a lot of your viewers probably know this because you asked for questions, but everyone's questions we're answering today were ones that were submitted and then we picked as I think really good discussion points.
Right.
And so unfortunately, I think the rest of our viewers that got picked didn't get to join us today, but we're not going to not answer those questions. So that's my first little plug there because I feel bad I missed that in the beginning. But I think in the breeding process, that's really interesting. So the breeding process actually is about a 10+ year cycle that happens. And I know there's a couple of things in there about aroma, about farm oil content, all of that. I would say all of those factors are considered, but I think what might be surprising to some people if they're not familiar is that some of the first things that are looked for in the breeding program are actually agronomic viability, right? So it needs to make sense for growers. So what that looks like is it pest resistant? Does it have a good pick window, right? We don't want a new awesome hop that everyone wants in the middle of the Citra Mosaic pick window, right? So there's a lot of those kinds of factors. What does it yield? How does it even pick? What's the cone formation look like, right? Things like that. And we had some virtual harvests. If you really want to deep dive on some of that, some of our talks were focused on hop breeding and sort of Hops 101, where we even had Jason Peralt, who is the hop breeder at Yakima Chief Ranches, give a really awesome talk about some of this stuff, and obviously way deeper than I'm going to go in it, but that's really some of the first things. And something Jason always says is it's a fail fast program, right? So we would never want hops that are maybe going to not be very agronomically viable, make it years into the program, or have a lot of brewers really wanting it when it's never going to make sense for growers to grow it. because ultimately that's going to just mean a detriment to the industry if it's really hard to get a hold of. And actually, if you look back, not to throw stones at any varieties that exist out there, right? But some varieties like Centennial are actually quite hard hops to grow, right?
I was just going to mention that.
Yeah,
Every year when I'm up there, I ask all the growers, what's the one hop you wish they didn't have to grow? And every year, every single one of them says Centennial.
Yeah, and it can vary quite a bit year from year on its yield and on its picking and how pests affect it and things like that. So part of the breeding program's efforts is to make something that's going to handle a lot of those challenges as best as possible. And then really from there, you know, that's happening in the first, you know, 2-3 years, right? Is you get your first year crosses, years 2 through 3, you're seeing how they grow. If something starts wilting a little bit, or you see a bunch of mites on it or something like that, it's getting called out of the program, right? So a lot of that stuff's happening early on. If you were to put percents on it, you know, it's going from year 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. You're seeing every year only maybe 1% of those hops actually making it to the next stage.
If I remember correctly, didn't you say when we were walking the research fields last year, it was like there's tens of thousands of plants here and probably one that will move into commercial production?
Yeah. If you were to, so there's actually a plot where those first year plantings go, and it fits about 20,000 plants in it, which if you look at that field, each plant is actually a unique variety because they all came from a cross. Right. And well, there you go. We got the development cycle on the screen. So
there you go. 1 out of 40,000. So there you go.
Yeah. So that field right now is about 20,000 in it. But from there, yes, maybe one of those plants. And there's some years that not a single one might make it out of there. But then I think another part of that question, right, is so we go on from there, and that's where you start getting a lot of the aroma and sort of flavor contribution research happening, right? Where it's like, okay, what is the oil content? What does it smell like? Is it pleasant? Is it unique? Is it going to do something interesting in beer? Is this a flavor or aroma that people are seeking, or maybe would be really good that maybe hasn't been seen before or isn't really strong in other varieties, right? And I think a good example of that is Sabro, released 2 years ago, right? It has really strong pineapple, coconut characters, things that you don't find in a lot of other hops. So that was really intriguing. It's a really early harvest, right? So when you look at that, it hits a good pick window. It hits a lot of nice flavor and aroma profiles. And then I think part of that question too is like, what kind of analysis? Well, some of it's sensory. We also do a lot of shared lab work with Yakima Chief ranches where we're doing a lot of oil analysis. We do use GCMS, right? And we're looking and diving deeper once things get farther into that program.
It sounds like, I mean, you guys are hitting all of that. You're doing the hedonics and the scientific objective stuff. I know what Nicole was saying earlier, that she had, just before we came on, that she had done 400 sniffs so far. So and it sounds like it's a fairly intensive process, particularly if you consider that you have that 10-year development cycle, which actually leads into the next question that was there from Stuart. And he said, how much has the hop selection process changed over the last 10 to 12 years? With the growth of craft, has there been a shift towards low yield, high flavor, aroma, away from high yield and high alpha acid? Were you able to predict that shift? What upcoming shifts are you seeing? And how far out do you have to plan until that hop yard can reach commercial viability? Or I'm guessing the hop variety. So it's how much of a wizard's ball do you guys have to have in order to know that, oh yeah, hey, by the way, the IPA market is going to do this now, and craft beer is going to return to things that want more noble hops or something? Like how much?
I think there's a lot of, I'll try to keep the answer on that one a little shorter because I think there's a lot there. But yes, we do have a crystal ball here in Yakima. We consult on a regular basis. I think that's my short answer. But I think the longer answer is probably, if you look at a lot of aroma varieties today coming through the Yakima Chief Ranch and Hop Breeding Company breeding program, they're all high alpha and really driven towards aroma, right? I think a lot of people would often reference as dual purpose hops. And I think some of that has actually been a benefit to the industry because you have the ability to consider them as alpha hops if needed to some degree. Not that that's obviously their intended use, but that they sort of fill some of that as well. So you're not necessarily pigeonholing yourself into saying, well, this could only ever end up as an alpha hop, right? Or this could only ever end up as an aroma hop. It won't have any other use. And so that's why you see, it's not uncommon for experimental varieties and a lot of varieties like Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe, Equinaut, right? They all have that 12+% alpha on a regular basis. So I think that's one answer. I think the other part of that would just be what we kind of talked about earlier is blending, right? Is that ability to, when we think of market changes, is When I think of life cycles of hops, Yakima is really fortunate with the weather conditions here and just the environment that a field can be planted and have some harvest within 1 year, right? Where if you go to Oregon, you're going to see that that's usually at least a 2-year turnaround, right, before you actually start getting something out of your field. So the industry here can react pretty quickly to new flavors and aroma needs, right? If so, something's really being pulled into the market, all of a sudden a new variety or experimental is of huge interest and it gets named, right? We can shift acreages pretty quickly and actually have something that year. So that's something that's very unique to the Yakima Valley and you don't find in really any other growing region is that flexibility. But blending is also something that helps us keep on pace with the ever changing sort of interest that consumers have in new flavors and aromas in beer.
Well, I was going to say, I think that's actually the real cruxes. I mean, you guys are always developing different varieties with different ideas and different targets, right? I mean, like Talus, for instance, isn't like, going to be set to be like the next Mosaic, right? They have some different usage. You have other hops that are coming forward. It seems like the real determiner for you guys, and like what we got caught out on in the late 2000s was just the amount of hop acreage planted and the amount of time to turn that new field into something viable. All right. So
I want to get into this one because this is one that I get a lot from home brewers. What's the difference between brewing with whole hops and pellets? Does brewing with one or the other affect the brewing process or finished product? So what's your thought on that, guys?
I'll let you take that, Brian. I haven't really had too much experience brewing with whole cones. Working in commercial breweries, the couple that I worked at, we didn't really brew with them. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think something to consider, and I mean, this is actually, Steve, it's interesting you say that, right? Because I think what you see is a lot of breweries tend not to use whole cone hops anymore, right? I mean, that was the standard when you think of brewing back in the day. But the reason why pellets exist is, and I guess why I would say it makes a big difference is, one is the whole cone itself has actually been pulverized and opened up and then squished together. And so you get a much higher surface area to your beer with your hop. And you're also getting that opening of glands and stuff like that. So that, I mean, it's all packaged and sealed, so you're not worrying about it degrading, but when you're using it, you're going to get a better efficiency of your oils and things like that into your beer. So that's part of it. And then really on the scale of commercial brewing, outside of home brewing, right, is also a 200-pound bale of hops. I mean, if you had it in the room, it would be the size of my table here, right, of whole cone hops. And if you did that down into pellets, it would be a stack of 4 boxes right in the middle of the table here, right? So part of it is also condensing space and storage. And part of that storage too is a whole cone bale of hops. When you're breaking it apart, there's actually residual oxygen within the bale, within the actual petioles themselves. And so part of that process when you're going from whole cone to pellet is actually breaking that apart. It's getting nitrogen flushed. And so you're actually creating a much more stable product. And so what we find, even if you look at like commercial breweries who use whole cone hops still, is they'll start out their year right after harvest using bales. They'll actually ship bales to breweries and they'll break them apart and use them. But they always want us to then spoil seal smaller portions of bales, nitrogen flush, just like your pellets, for later use in the year. Because if you were to just leave bales sitting even in a cold environment for months and months and months, they're going to degrade much more rapidly than when they get pelletized and sealed in a bag. And now they're completely stable for up to 3 years.
I was going to say, I've seen way more brown whole cones than I've ever seen brown pellets. It seems like you have to abuse the hell out of a pellet in order to get to really go brown.
Yeah, I mean, when I can say when I use whole cones, because, you know, I obviously live in Yakima and fortunate to be able to grab a whole cone sometimes. And I actually will usually like pulverize them myself at home. If I use them that way, I'll take like a bullet, a NutriBullet or something, right, and like break them up. Using them whole, I just don't think you're going to get as much out of them.
There you go. Well, and we got one last question I think that we had in the picked list to get through, and we got 10 minutes. So the last question comes from Anthony, and he asked, the terroir of hops will obviously vary from place to place. Chinook from the Northwest is much more pine forward than the Chinook from Michigan, which can be quite fruity, and I would say pineapple upside down cake. However, how often is variance from year to year from the same area tracked in terms of flavor and perception, and not just measured alpha acids and other common measurable statistics? For example, For example, it's often discussed that Citra from 2018 to 2019 is worlds different than Citra from 2012 to 2013, yet it doesn't seem as if the alphas have changed much. Is the vintage profile of a harvest tracked from year to year? And if so, what is the process for going about doing that?
So
Answer,
actually,
please.
this is a really good overlap to Michael, to your question too about research, right? So this is something we look at quite a bit is, we actually have a system that growers use to track their information. We log all of our sensory, and that's connected to the same system, right? So growers can actually see our sensory feedback from year over year, just as much as we can see what field did that lot come out of, right? What was their pick window? What was their kiln temperatures, right? So we're matching up a lot of this data all the time. And then we actually, with customers selecting hops, we're taking their feedback and actually plugging that in too. So we're actually overlaying that a lot and seeing, okay, this one field year over year, did the pick window change? Was it blended with another field? What did people think of it? And what's quite amazing is you do see some fields that vary quite a bit from year to year, right? And sometimes it just has to do with the year. A pick window is something that floats based on the year. So some years, you might hear us say, well, things are a little early this year, a little late. So it's never going to be like September 1st every year this one field was picked on this day, because it could, but first or the third could actually still be kind of the same in the life cycle of that hop. So that's something we track. And I actually, just an interesting anecdote actually is through selection, it's been pretty fascinating sometimes to see brewers will come rub and smell a hop and be like, this smells a lot like what I was using last year. And we'll dig and be like, yeah, it was actually the exact same field that you picked last year, right? So it's pretty fascinating to see that year over year that that can happen. I know it seems like kind of a far shot sometimes, but I personally witnessed it. It's happened several times where people can actually pick up a very consistent sort of aroma character from year over year. So when I think of terroir in general, knowing that, that's a lot of different factors, at the end of the day, there is something to be said about where that field is, its soil, the environment it experiences, its own little microclimate based on just where it is, can actually have a pretty significant effect on hops.
Well, and that leads me to wonder, so, because obviously people talk a lot about terroir and grapes, and we even joked around about the fact, like, I like Zinfandels from this one particular mountain facing in this particular direction in Napa Valley, right? Do you think there's going to be more exploration of this, or is the idea really, we want to be able to say, Citra is Citra, it's not Citra from this ranch that smells this particular way, like they do in the wine world, for instance?
Yeah, I think that's where kind of our part of that research then is not just understanding that, is saying, how do we, this maybe goes back to kind of, Mark, what you talked about consistency and brand and things like that, is, are there indicators out there where we could start thinking about what a field might be like, or even what we would do with a certain field and how it might match up with other fields, right? Or things like that, that if you had enough data, you could maybe start making some assumptions around things before they actually happen, right? Or see where needs are, maybe see where concerns are, right? Things like that.
And I know we had another question further down the list that also talked about, like, hey, could you actually try and recreate that Michigan Chinook character in the Pacific Northwest? And the problem is it's not just the dirt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in theory, there's maybe a way to try to do that. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, you could add and change soil to some degree to try to recreate maybe the exact environment. But I think if you were to take a pot of soil out of Yakima, right, and bring it home with you and try to grow Chinook there and replicate something here, I mean, yes, you're going to think of where's your position on the earth and what's its sun timing like, right? What is the weather like where you are? What's the normal temperatures? What sort of mold spores are in the air where you are? And what sort of pressures does that plant interact with that maybe it wouldn't here? And those are things I don't know if you'd ever really be able to recreate.
Well, and I think there was a talk last year at Hop and Brew School where the conversation was about the terroir, and I think it was around Amarillo, right? And it was Amarillo grown in Washington, Amarillo grown in Idaho, and Amarillo grown in Germany. And the fact that in the sensory analysis and the oil analysis, Amarillo from Germany and Idaho were more similar to each other than the Amarillo from Idaho and Washington.
Right.
And so this is I think a very fascinating conversation that will keep going for a good long while.
Yeah, and I think, like we kind of touched on here, but terroir gets you all the way up to when it's picked, right, to some degree. But there, like we kind of touched on already, you have to think about moistures and kiln temperatures and times on the farm and handling and even processing time once it gets to YCH, right? There's so many other variables that at the end of the day, if you're trying to recreate something that you used in a beer, there's a whole bunch of other factors there between field practices to when you might actually be using it. And that's something that, is not always known or even, necessarily recreatable where you might be.
Well, and there's a tied-in question from an anonymous attendee who says that over the years, how have growers tried to keep varieties consistent all while working with what Mother Nature gives them? That goes back to some of the agronomics that you guys were talking about earlier.
Yeah, definitely. How do they keep them consistent? Well, I mean, a really big part of it, it's interesting, I think as a whole, everyone's always really excited and focused on harvest, right? But if you were actually talk to a lot of growers and you go out to their farm early in the spring, February, March, they have all their crews out, and their crews are out, changing over fields, propagating roots. Then you get into stringing and twining. And if you talk to any growers, it's like, this is actually what sets our harvest. It's right now, right? It's did we do this at the right time? Did we do it correctly? Everything from there follows, right? So there's actually a lot that's happening early in the spring. And then, just practices, how our fields being handled and treated throughout the summer. What's water look like, all those kinds of factors along the way that sort of also play into that. And I would say, part of that Yakima Chief Ranch guideline that I mentioned around practices does have some guidance on use of sprays and things like that, and timing and windows, so that all of those varieties are experiencing similarities throughout the growing season as well. So that's a good question.
Yeah, awesome. So I think that's the end of the questions that we'd had selected. And lots of information. Obviously, we can keep talking about this for hours and hours and hours and hours, and we might be doing some of that in the future on the podcast here, bringing you guys in to answering some of the other questions that didn't get answered today.
Yeah, awesome.
All right.
Well, thank you guys all very much. It's really nice having everyone on here. It's a great hangout. Really, really good questions. I appreciate it. This makes me only want to do this more. This is a lot of fun.
And I think it is fun in these days when we can't be actually in the same space. So I appreciate the opportunity that you guys had to give us a chance to talk.
Yeah, and I just want to encourage everybody, should the world return to normal and Hop and Brew School resume, it's an experience not to be missed if you're into beer and brewing. It's tons of fun and an enormous amount of great information too. So thanks for asking us to get involved here, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Well, I also wanted to say thank you to the guys who joined us after asking their questions. Appreciate you guys taking the time to sit here, and hopefully we gave you guys mostly good information.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us on.
Nicole is going to send you guys some really cool stuff, believe me.
Yeah,
Awesome.
We've got some stuff headed your way, and Denny and Drew, maybe we'll have to give away a couple Hop and Brew School registrations for next year.
Good idea. We'll run a contest on the podcast and give away some Hop and Brew School registrations.
There we go. We can do that. So
cool.
Well, thank you guys so much for your time tonight and all this amazing, valuable information. We really appreciate you guys, your panelists, and thank you guys for your questions. So the three of you, as well as the ones that couldn't make it tonight. And just a reminder, this session was recorded, so we'll be posting it on Virtual Harvest here within the next hour or so. So feel free to take a look at that, share it with your friends. And if you have any questions, especially those that might be viewing this later, feel free to email brewschool@yakimachief.com. And then if you have any brewing questions, homebrew to commercial size, feel free to email our brewing help@yakimachief.com. We have a great in-house team of experts that are always around to help you guys out with some of your questions. Other than that, thank you guys so much, and everyone have a great evening, and we'll see you all later.
Bye-bye.
All right, thanks everyone. And Philip, if you want to send some of that red IPA this way once it's made.
Sounds good. I'll make a road trip up.
Brian will do a sensory for you.
Perfect.
All right. No, thank you very much, Philip, Mark, Michael. It's great having you on.
All right, guys. See you later.
Everyone have a lovely weekend. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.